Is there Russian collusion as we sit here at the end of July after all these months, or is there smoke as opposed to fire?
There is absolutely right now no evidence of Russian collusion. There is smoke now. There is definitely some smoke, and that was raised, those concerns were raised because of the Donald Trump Jr. meeting. And I think that when it comes to the end, I mean, we've seen Robert Mueller right now just said they can go ahead and testify before the House. I think if there was actual collusion or something severely criminal about the actions that took place during those meetings with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, Veselnitskaya, the female Russian attorney that was actually lobbying against the Magnitsky Act, which is what the Russians have been doing now forever, it seems, since it went through, since the death of Sergei Magnitsky and those sanctions came about under Obama. He wouldn't allow them. He wouldn't say, go ahead and testify publicly. I think that would be very close hold, and that they would be interviewing them much more extensively, and they would probably not be given that kind of like leeway to testify in a House, you know, openly before the committee. So I think that although there is smoke, there is no evidence of collusion as of yet. And that was something that we were very specific with on every story. To date, there has been no evidence of collusion. We do see a lot of evidence of money exchanging hands or meetings as well, you know, on Hillary Clinton's side. So a lot of the stories that we were looking at too also showed that there was a lot of evidence, apparently, that led people to believe that there was something going on as well with the Russians and Hillary Clinton, as well as former President Bill Clinton.
So let's talk some more about the other things that you focused on with your reporting. I think you were the beginning of the unmasking, the unlawful unmasking. What have we learned from your reporting and others now about the Obama team doing political espionage that was unlawful, I think, to their political opponents? Say more.
Well, this is what is actually being investigated by the House Intelligence Committee right now. And I think the Senate Intelligence Committee is also looking into this as well, more so on the House side. So what we were able to discover was actual documentation. And this came through, you know, documents from the NSA as well as the FISA courts that showed that the Obama administration actually loosened up the rules in 2011 on unmasking of Americans. Those are intercepted phone calls and communications overseas under the Section 702, which is part of the FISA, which allows our U.S. intelligence community basically to look at phone calls and communications of foreigners. Now, what happens is there's incidental phone conversations. For example, you would probably call someone overseas and let's say you have an aunt who's Ukrainian or a friend who's Russian or Chinese. Your phone conversation could be intercepted, but under the law, prior to the 2011 expansion as well, under the law, your name should be kept very well guarded. There is no need, in most cases, for anyone in the United States to unmask your name and share it among the intelligence community. That was kept very close hold. So an analyst may look at it and say, well, this is an interesting conversation. I may need to unmask this person. That has happened in the past. And then they would get permission. They would have to explain why they would need to unmask your name to understand the conversation. Most of the time, and this is talking to a lot of people within the intelligence community, as well as officials, that was unnecessary. You could pretty much understand the conversation by just looking at it. What had happened was, under the Obama administration, those were loosened. So they didn't have to give a lot of explanation. And it wasn't just analysts that were looking at this information, but it was officials within the administration. Susan Rice, Samantha, the former national security advisor to President Obama, Samantha Power, the UN ambassador, John Brennan, who's head of the CIA. These are managerial positions. It's very rare that somebody in this kind of directorship would really be involved in the nitty-gritty of an operation that an analyst was looking at, unless it had something to do with, for example, Osama bin Laden and getting authorization to target him. Then, of course, the president, the CIA director, and everybody would be involved. But not necessarily for Joe Blow talking to somebody else, or even in a terrorist thing. So what we discovered was they were unmasking at an exponential rate. So from 2011 until January, the unmasking increased over 300%. There were also intercepts of upstream communications from the internet. And we discovered that they were basically accessing emails. 1 out of every 20 Americans. It was incredible. It was like 5% of all American communications, 1 out of every 20.
Do you have reason to believe they were political opponents of Obama that were the targets?
Yes, there is reason to suspect that. Now, mind you, we don't have those documents in front of us because they're considered classified. And that's something that a lot of people want exposed. What were they looking at? What were these conversations? Were they just Russia, terrorism related? According to Chairman Nunes and other people who have had access to these documents, they weren't, all of them were not included in those need to know reasons of why you would unmask an American. So maybe it was somebody having a conversation with a relative. We don't know. Some people have described it as very like, it would be like a security personnel that you hired to spy on your ex-wife or your ex-husband, gathering information. So there is a lot of concern. There's also a lot of concern within the FBI and within the intelligence community that they were being used, or that the American public is looking at our own intelligence community now as somebody who's participating in political espionage or spying on Americans and, violating their Fourth Amendment rights. So there is a lot of concern right now that this was being misused, and that's why there's an investigation.
So what should the Congress do now that FISA is up for reauthorization by a Republican Congress? What would you like answers for about the possible abuse of power that's gone on by the Obama administration, the same team that abused the IRS against its political opponents? What would you like to know of the Congress?
I think the Congress needs to take this very seriously. I think there needs to be a full investigation into who was unmasking and why, and what they were unmasking. I think the American people, as long as it doesn't violate anyone's rights, should have an idea of what they were looking at. We may not be able to see the exact conversations, but they could say, well, this was interesting because they were looking at a conversation between so-and-so's wife and her mother. Why would that be? So we need to know the full scope of what they were accessing and what they were looking at. You know, those laws also expanded in 2015 and gave the FBI the authority to look at priests, communications between attorney-client privilege, other very doctors, other very sensitive roles, journalists, other very sensitive roles that you would think would be guarded and protected. And now we know that those weren't. And now we know that even the FISA court themselves chided the FBI, chided the NSA for this abuse of power. So I think Congress really needs to take a very good look at what happened. They need to expose this in the best way possible so that the American people can best determine what's right for them and if this is violating the Fourth Amendment rights. And if we do, which a lot of the sources that I've spoken to, both in the intelligence community and in law enforcement, need Section 702, then maybe we need to roll back some of these expansions, or we need to take a look at it and find a better way of protecting Americans so that our law enforcement can do its job, go after the bad guys, go after those enemy state actors, but not let this be abused for political espionage or to gather intelligence on somebody who you find to be an opponent or somebody that you don't agree with.
If this isn't fixed, if this abuse of power or power grab that's been exposed about the Obama administration doesn't get fixed, what's the risk for America, a land of freedom and liberty and what we came to think of America?
It's a huge risk. It's a risk to our Constitution. It's a risk to our foundation of what we stand on. I mean, this doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen in America. We have a checks and balances system. We have an executive branch. You know, we have a judicial branch. We have a legislative branch. They all balance each other out. There needs to be good oversight. This can't happen. You know, I explained this the other day to someone. It's like Russia. This is what you want to talk about Russia? This is what countries like Russia do. Vladimir Putin, he can listen in on conversations. He can see what, you know, how many reporters have been killed in Russia, how many people have disappeared off the map, you know, when a story has not been what somebody there wants, how many people have been blackmailed. Look at other countries around the world. This is what makes us exceptional and different. This is the reason why people line up for liberty, to come into this country and to have freedoms. It would be an erosion of our Constitution, and any erosion of our Constitution is an erosion of our country.
So tell us the things that you're learning from whistleblowers about the FBI. What's going on there that you wish there was more focused attention on by the elite media?
So, for example, Michael Flynn, just the leaking of his name. There were very few people that had access to those, they call them tech cuts. They are the conversations that took place between Flynn and Sergei Kislyak. This is highly classified material. It would have been maybe under 10 people that would have had access to it. So you would think it would be simple, right, to investigate this and find out who leaked that name, because this is a true erosion. I mean, this is a person's life, their livelihood at stake, and they're being judged in the media before they even go to trial, right? So it's being used as a political tool. And it worked. I mean, he was removed. Eventually, he was fired as National Security Advisor under a lot of pressure. And, you know, he himself has said openly, you know, that he tried to give as much clarity as he could on all of his conversations, and he didn't give everything. But that in and of itself, that type of information is highly classified. I would like to know, and this is what I've been hearing from sources within law enforcement, who's in charge of these leak investigations? Who are they looking at? Are they polygraphing people that had access to these tech cuts? Did anyone fail the polygraph? Were any of those people closely connected to people at the Washington Post? Because remember, it wasn't just that leak. There have been a number of leaks subsequently after that have come out. And then we saw former director James Comey himself, FBI Director James Comey, admit that he even leaked memos that he had written about the president. So who else is involved in all of this leaking? And the concern is that for people within the intelligence community and within law enforcement, how can they conduct an investigation when the investigations are being manipulated by people with access to this information, and they're being thrown out in the media, and they can't even correct it, even if it's wrong, because they're under the guise of classification. They can't even go out to the media and say, hey, your story's wrong, you need to retract it.
Talk more about the FBI.
So what's very fascinating about the Hillary Clinton Foundation and the investigation that was going on, there were 5 FBI field offices actually investigating, various parts of the Clinton Foundation, and also the Clinton email server and all of this. But when Director Comey, and right now we don't know if the FBI is continuing to reopen the Clinton Foundation investigation or not. That's still sitting there. The FBI never really officially closes investigations unless they're absolutely done, right? Signed, sealed, and delivered. But what I could tell you this is that in different stations throughout the United States, FBI field offices, when Director Comey made the announcement that they weren't going to go forward with the case against Hillary Clinton and the email server, a number of FBI agents publicly displayed their anger about that. and felt like the rug had been pulled out from under them. I know I was told at one FBI field office in particular, a few agents got up and threw their sandwiches they were eating at the time at the television set in anger. And there's a lot of anger within the FBI. And that's not just me saying this. Remember, Andrew McCabe, when he testified, did say to Congress that there were some FBI agents pretty upset about how that was handled. And as far as the Clinton Foundation, I think there's a lot more that remains to be seen there. Like I said, I don't think that it's completely closed. So acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe became a focal point in all of this. I mean, it appeared that he was very politically charged. His wife was running for the state senate in Virginia, and it came to our attention that there were a number of investigations into McCabe within the government. One was the money that, and it's a Department of Justice Inspector General investigation. His wife was given nearly $500,000 and an extra $200,000, well, first by Governor Terry McAuliffe's PAC, $500,000 to run for state senate, plus another $200,000 from a DNC PAC. Now, these were both connected to Hillary Clinton. Terry McAuliffe is a close ally of Hillary Clinton. Now, think of this. The average cost to run for the state senate is roughly around $60,000. This was one of the most expensive campaigns ever. She still lost, but nearly $700,000. At the same time, Terry McAuliffe was under investigation for donations and handling of finances. That seemed to have disappeared. So, and Andrew McCabe has been in charge of a lot of these investigations, including Russia, because he was head of the FBI field office here in Washington, D.C. And so it wasn't like he just jumped into it at a later date. I mean, he had oversight over all the Russia investigations. So then here, this is very interesting. He's a close ally of Hillary Clinton. Now we find out that Andrew McCabe, we had a lady that was a whistleblower, she was Special Agent Robin Gritz, who was highly commended, probably one of the best counterterrorism agents in the FBI, who went after the FBI on a sexual discrimination lawsuit, mainly because of McCabe and a few other senior people who kept her from moving up. What was so fascinating about this, though, this investigation, right, was the fact that Michael Flynn played a role in it. So here's Mike Flynn. Now, people within the FBI have told me, and these are sources that I've spoken to, who've overheard McCabe make disparaging remarks about Flynn. This is even before he was removed. So there were a lot of issues here. But when I heard about this case, the sexual discrimination case, and at the time people thought that McCabe had gone after her, for work-related issues, that she had filed the sexual discrimination case after McCabe was going after her for work-related issues. What John and I discovered was that McCabe himself admits that the FBI didn't launch an investigation into her until he found out she was filing an EEOC complaint against them. So it appears to be retaliatory. We could just say appears. And so now there's that investigation, right? And then to top it off, there's a Hatch investigation into him for basically violating the Hatch Act rules, which are much more stringent for FBI. And that means, he can't be out there using his position at the FBI to support his wife. He could support his wife, but he can't be touting that he's FBI, he's the, deputy director, and these things of this nature. So, which was really fascinating because right near his office is a sign about the Hatch Act rules and not violating them. But, there's all of these pictures with him supporting his wife. And one thing that was very interesting under the Hatch Act investigation, when John and I FOIA'd all of the documentation between him and Terry McAuliffe, was his official FBI bio. So it appears that, the FBI sent his official bio when he was trying to raise money for his wife and everything. So that now we know for sure that the Office of Special Counsel has expanded their Hatch Act investigation into him. So there's actually 3 investigations into McCabe right now, and it remains to be seen how the new FBI director, Ray, will handle his new deputy director. So there's some talk that things may change there.
What you're describing, Sara, is a very powerful President Obama and team that used their power against political enemies. But now you'd think that President Trump would have that same capacity as an executive, but it feels like the deep state is working against him.
I think there, particularly like with the sources that I've been speaking with, there is an enormous concern that there are people still within the government that are working contrary to the administration and the administration's policies and plans. And that's enormously concerning for them, because as they try to move forward with policy, if there's people within there that are opposing that policy or don't want to see that policy changed, they have access to a lot of information, they have access to a lot and have a lot of knowledge, and they can leak that information to the public and derail what the administration is trying to do. But the buck stops with the president, right? A lot of people say this. And the president needs to be informed. He needs to understand what's happening within his own administration. And I know there's a lot of concern that a lot of positions haven't been filled yet. I've been hearing that from people within the administration. So there's this feeling of there's a feeling of an ominous cloud over the administration right now, and there needs to be a lift of that cloud. I could say that that's how people are feeling.
And in America, what does that mean if there's a duly elected president by the people and there's forces within our federal government working against a duly elected president? What does that mean?
It's concerning. It's concerning because you can't move forward. And a lot of people say they feel they can't move forward without taking 10 steps back. But it's also something that, sources even close to the president have spoken about that totally support him and have his confidence. The president needs to really assess what's happening within the administration. And it's been 6 months in right now that we're talking. Really assess what's going on and make decisions with the people that he trusts most to really look at the various departments, look at these, his agenda, ensure that his agenda is moving forward. And if it's not, he needs to question those people within those departments and those agencies to find out why it's not moving forward. One of the things that the Democrats were so successful at for a long time and still appear to be is they stay on message, and they find a way to work together. Even if the message to most people could be completely wrong. If we're investigating like Russia collusion, right? The message was very much the same. And everyone kind of stuck with that same message until it started to unravel, and then they found a new message, right, that they all stuck with. I think for a Republican Congress, this is a difficult time. And we've seen, a lot of fractured in-house fighting, and that really doesn't accomplish much. So I think there needs to be areas where a Republican Congress, look, they're in control. They're in control of the House and the Senate, and there's a Republican president. If we're going to go back to the stories that we broke, the House, the Senate, needs to hold hearings where they subpoena the people that appeared to have violated the laws with the NSA. They need to subpoena Susan Rice, Samantha Power, John Brennan, anybody again, and they need to make the public aware of what that administration, what the Obama administration and the people that were working with him were looking at. And if they violated the law, and that is found out to be true, or if these expansions have allowed them too much power, then a Republican Congress needs to get together. They need to find a way to make it right and at the same time still give our law enforcement the tools that they need to fight terrorists and to fight enemy states.
So Sara, for those who aren't familiar with Sara Carter, tell us your background, where you've worked, and what you're doing now.
So I have a long background history. I grew up in the Middle East. I spent most of my life in my childhood in Saudi Arabia and other parts of Africa. So of course my career took me back to those parts of the world, including South Asia. So I started to work as a journalist at the Daily Bulletin, the Los Angeles News Group in LA, covering mainly the US-Mexico border, drug cartels, gangs, and things of that nature. That led me eventually to be recruited by the Washington Times. When John Solomon came over to the Times, I was recruited as the Pentagon correspondent. In fact, I was emphatic that I would only go if I was allowed to do war coverage and cover the Pentagon. So I came over to Washington, D.C., and started working for the Times, and most of my coverage over my career here in Washington has been overseas as a war correspondent, as a journalist overseas. Eventually, I went from the Times to the Washington Examiner, where I had a column for 3.5 years, and I still traveled extensively to Afghanistan and Pakistan covering the war. And after that, I went to the Blaze Network, where I continued my coverage going overseas, spending a lot of time in various parts of the country and other parts of the world. I went back to Iraq eventually when I was covering stories with USA Today, US News, World Report after leaving the Blaze, and Arutz Sheva in Israel. And I covered ISIS in Iraq. Did a documentary, and eventually John Solomon came back into my life and recruited me to Circa News, which is part of Sinclair Broadcast Group. And at that point, I was still covering terrorism and foreign issues when I became involved in the presidential election. So everything changed for me at that point. I interviewed then President-elect Trump a number of times, covering all the issues on the campaign trail and his family as well and others, and eventually ended up covering election night from the Trump Victory Party, which ended up being the Victory Party. And and so it was just I rolled in from overseas coverage, war coverage, drug cartels into American politics.